right. As we begin this morning, you're seeing my screen backdrop there because before we get into the book of Acts, pick up there was a question asked last week that your teacher, because he's not the smartest Bible scholar who's ever walked the face of the earth, he was certainly not prepared to fully answer that question. But went home, and Lisa and I talked and thought it would be a good idea if we took a few minutes to answer the question that was asked. And that question is, what's the origin of the Pharisees and the Sadducees? So we are going to take a look at that for a few moments with a little bonus thrown in. There's a related group that doesn't get mentioned often, and that is the Essenes. So again, I had to go back and do some study on this. Back in the day, I was really good at remembering dates and all of those kind of things. Not so much anymore there. So let's take a few minutes and let's look at this. Does anybody know? Does anybody want to raise their hand and say, yeah, I could have taught that from memory last week? There, I know exactly when the Pharisees, Sadducees all came about, all of that kind of stuff. Yeah. Okay, thank you for making me feel a little bit better there. All right, so let's start out with some background here, just a little bit of history to lead up to this, okay? So you may remember that the children of Israel had been hauled off to captivity, and in 537 BC, Cyrus allowed the Jews to return to Jerusalem and rebuild the temple, but they were not allowed to have a king. Okay? So, at that time, we're all familiar with the succession of the kings leading up to them being taken into captivity. But when they returned, no king. And so the religious leaders then kind of became the de facto leaders of the nation there. Okay? In 332 BC, Alexander the Great pretty much conquered most of the whole known world at that time. Then in 198 BC, there was a group called the Seleucids, and they conquered the Middle East there and took over control. Then in 165, we have Jerusalem liberated as part of the Maccabean revolt there. Okay, so the Maccabeans were Jews. They revolted against the Seleucids. They liberated Jerusalem. And in 141 BC, now keep these last two dates in mind especially, 165 BC and 141 BC there. In 141 BC, there was, I think he was the son of the original Maccabean leader, but his name was Simon Maccabeus, and he was basically they had a little council, and he was appointed high priest, okay? And this is considered the start of what is known as the Hasmonean dynasty, okay? All right. So, now, with that little bit of background in mind, what about the question that was asked, the Pharisees, the Sadducees, okay? Well, we're going to start actually with the Sadducees because they are the oldest of the three groups, to the best we can tell, at least by a few years, okay? Now, with the Sadducees, there's the most controversy of when did the Sadducees form or become a group there. And here is the short answer. We don't know exactly, okay? And depending on who you read, you'll get a whole lot of different information. Some historians trace them all the way back to Zadok, who was high priest in the time of David. You can read about him in 2 Samuel chapter 15. This is based almost exclusively on the fact that in Hebrew, Zadok and Sadducee are basically almost identical words there. Okay? So that's what some people will tell you. No one has an encyclopedia anymore, but if you go to Wikipedia there, what they will tell you is that you can trace the Sadducees back to right after Cyrus allowed the Jews to return, sometime in the 537 to 515 BC time frame. Okay? But all we know for sure is this. They don't definitively appear in history until the 2nd century BC. Okay? They're sometime between 200 BC and 100 BC there. Okay? They became very, very prominent during that Hasmonean period that started there about in the middle of the 2nd century BC. That's when we really, really see them start to come to prominence there. Okay? All right. So, we don't know a whole lot about the Sadducees, and that is partly because they left behind no writings of their own. Okay? None. And I mean that literally none. Not because they were illiterate or anything like that, they certainly weren't, but they left behind no written history there. So most of what we know about them comes from 3 sources. Okay? The writings of their opponents, the Pharisees, okay, there. So keep in mind there could be some bias in those writings, certainly. Okay? They are obviously mentioned in the New Testament, so we know some things about them from the New Testament. And then we also know a fair amount about them by the historian Josephus. Okay? But now, keep in mind, Josephus was a Pharisee. Okay, there. So, some possible bias in his writings there. Okay? They disappear completely from history with the destruction of the temple in AD 70 because everything about them was about the temple. As we go into to what they believed, well, we most, I think, know this. They only accepted the first 5 books, the books of Moses there, okay? That they completely discounted the prophets, the Psalms, all of that. They were just non-existent as far as the Sadducees were concerned. Now, because the first 5 books, the Torah, do not mention the resurrection, okay? There's never a resurrection mentioned in any of those first 5 books of the Bible there, of the Old Testament. Since that's the only thing the Sadducees believed in, accepted, then they did not believe in a resurrection, nor did they believe in angels or spirits. Okay? All right. They were a worldly people. I mean, they claimed to believe in the first 5 books of the Old Testament there, the Torah, but they were very, very worldly minded people. They were worldly, they were upper class there, they were of the high priestly lineage, and boy, would they let you know it, okay, there. They embraced both the Hellenistic society that some of the conquerors, Alexander the Great, when he came and conquered everything, they kind of embraced the Hellenistic lifestyle there. And when the Romans took over, well, then they embraced the Romans as a way to stay in power. Okay? All right? And remember what we said. Who, going back to our study in the book of Acts, who's the high priest? Caiaphas or Caiaphas there, yeah. And Caiaphas was a Sadducee. Who had the majority of the seats in the Sanhedrin? The Sadducees did, okay? So they were very, very much political operators there and concerned about keeping power for themselves, at least in regards to the Jewish nation there. All right, yes, sir.
Interesting that they only accepted the 5 books of Moses, but Moses certainly did write about angels.
Yeah, and that's actually why I separated out that they did not believe in the resurrection, because the 5 books of the law do not mention the resurrection there. But yes, the part about they didn't believe in angels and spirits either there, that's a different story. Okay. Yep. So great comment. Yes?
But then Jesus confronts them about the resurrection by using, that God said, I am the God of Abraham, Isaac,
Yes.
and Jacob.
Yes. Yeah. Another good point. Jesus told them, I am the God of Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, not I was the God. The I am implies Abraham, Jacob, Isaac still exists. Yes, Shannon, if you can, yes, please. Thank you.
I don't mean to go off in a rabbit hole, but I just learned this week that most Jews do not believe in hell. And they don't believe that if you are not a faithful Jew, you just don't go anywhere. You do not go to hell. And then I started looking it up in the Old Testament, and there's no reference to hell. There is to Sheol, but
Gehenna.
there is not a reference to the non-believers going to hell.
Yeah. Yeah, the closest thing you have to it is Gehenna, which was basically the landfill outside Jerusalem, which was continually burning there. Okay. Yeah. I remember both mine and Lisa's reactions the first time that we learned or met someone who was a Jewish atheist. Kind of seems like an oxymoron almost, doesn't it? But they are Jewish solely in the same way that I'm an American. Okay, there. It was a genealogical thing. Has nothing, being Jewish has nothing to do with religion there. Brother Robert first, and then Sister Judy.
Just a comment, and maybe you'll get there and maybe not, but I'm just thinking that the destruction of Jerusalem has a lot to do with God's purpose. And that was everything in ancestry was destroyed in the destruction of Jerusalem. There was no records any longer. I mean, there was no gold in the stones because it was pulled away. And God decided that there will be none of that. Mm-hmm. Man decided differently once they tried to reconstruct. And they couldn't reconstruct anything, so they just did it any way they could. They could not reconstruct the ancestry of any of the tribes. None. Not even the Levites or anything like that. So the priesthood was gone as well. So therein lies the fault of man, again, when they tried to reconstruct and say, well, I'm from this tribe, and they try to say this today, that there are different tribes, and they have no idea the origin of such things.
Yeah, you get into all kinds of and myths and legends and everything like that there. You know, one thing that my father was big into genealogy, and so I know my genealogy back to my original ancestor back in the late 1700s. And my favorite story in my genealogy is one of my however many great-grandfathers there was the sole survivor of an Indian raid on a fort where he escaped because he was a big man. He killed one of the Indians, picked him up, and used him as a club as he fought his way out of the fort. There tends to be a lot of, shall we say, slight exaggeration when we don't know absolute genealogies there. So, yes, Sister Judy.
When I was working, I worked with ladies that were Jewish. I found out that they knew little about the Bible and that they're really much like Christians. They take and leave what they want. They don't, the ladies that I was with would not eat pig meat. So they had to be sure that if we had hot dogs, they were pure beef hot dogs. So it's just, they're as confused as most of Christianity.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. You know, and when you think about it, God tore the veil of the temple in two when Jesus died on the cross. And less than 50 years later, the temple is razed to the ground. And it's never coming back. There is a Muslim mosque on the site of the temple, and it's not going anywhere there. God made his judgment very, very clear. Huh? Yeah. Yeah. Well, yeah. Their blood is the same. You know, boy, talk about a tangent there. Race is not a biological concept there. It has no foundation in biology whatsoever there. All right. Okay, let's move on to the Pharisees. Okay, so what about the origin of the Pharisees? Well, they appear to have emerged out of a group of scribes during the Hasmonean dynasty. See why I'm emphasized, remember that Hasmonean dynasty thing in the middle of the 2nd century here. Okay, so there were scribes, not priests, scribes. The Sadducees came out of the priests there, okay? The Pharisees came out of the scribes. Again, sometime after the middle of the 2nd century BC, okay? They are obviously mentioned quite heavily in the New Testament, and Josephus, surprisingly, wrote quite favorably of them, or not so surprisingly, wrote quite favorably there. They obviously did leave behind many of their own writings, and their name means separated, okay? Separated, set apart, okay? All right? In terms of their beliefs, they did accept all of what we now call the Old Testament, okay? But, and this was the thing that Jesus condemned them for so heavily, is that they gave as much weight to their oral traditions as they did the written law, the 5 books of Moses. The traditions handed down from their elders carried as much weight as what Moses wrote to them. And that's why, Jesus would condemn them, for tithing even the smallest amount of their herbs that they collected there, but yet they neglected the weightier matters of the law. Okay? So they did believe in the resurrection, angels, and spirits there. And they were, blue collar was the term that was kind of used. What is meant by that is whereas the Sadducees were elite and they were just plain better than you there, the Pharisees were more common people there, okay? And because of that, they were more popular with the common people there, the Jewish nation as a whole, okay? Interestingly enough, of the three groups that we're looking at this morning, they survived the longest of the three there, okay? They were responsible for the compilation of what is now known as the Mishnah, which was their oral law that they finally got around to committing to writing in around AD 200 and is part of the Talmud. Okay? And the whole rabbinical Judaism system that we have today and the modern day synagogues that we have today, these all came about because of the works of the Pharisees in the 1st and 2nd centuries AD. There, okay? All right. So, remember, I've said a couple of times now, the way you remember them, it is sad, you see, that they did not believe in the resurrection, angels, spirits, okay? It is fair, you see, that they at least did believe in the resurrection, angels, and spirits. But, keeping in mind, who did Jesus spend more time criticizing? The Pharisees by several orders of magnitude there. Okay, now, while this was not part of the original question, okay, there is a third group that we should talk about here, and that is the group called the Essenes. The Essenes. Okay, they appear in history about 100 BC, so a little bit later than the Sadducees and the Pharisees do by, let's round it off and say 50 years or so. Okay? The Essenes are not mentioned in the New Testament, at least not definitively. There are some people who claim that, I think it's a passage in Mark and a passage in Colossians, are references to the Essenes. That is speculation there, because they are definitely not mentioned in the New Testament, but they are talked about. Most of what we know about them comes from the writings of Josephus. Okay. Primary thing about them, they separated themselves even more than the Pharisees did. You know, the Pharisees, they lived in the cities and the villages and the towns, but they just wouldn't associate with you, you know, if they thought you were unclean or anything like that. The Essenes essentially went off, lived in the desert there, and they practiced ritual purity. They were kind of similar to the Pharisees in a lot of their beliefs, in a lot of their practices there. They completely separated, and you could say they lived in communes there. They had their own separate villages that they lived in there. Of course, the most famous of these was Qumran by the Dead Sea. Okay? The light bulb's going off in your head. Yeah, we'll get there in just a minute. They also disappear after the destruction of Jerusalem. Okay? You just disappear from history. From what I read, they probably never numbered more than about 4,000 people total. Okay? There. All right. So what about their beliefs? Well, they believed that there were sons of light and sons of darkness. And of course, they were the sons of light. And everybody else, including the Pharisees, Sadducees, Everybody else were sons of darkness. They believed that there was going to be an apocalypse, at which point in time the Messiah would come and establish an earthly kingdom. Okay? Now, from that, you kind of see why they disappeared from history after the destruction of Jerusalem in AD 70 there, because that whole idea went with that. They practiced strict adherence to the Torah, and they were especially strict about not taking oaths. Okay? Interestingly enough, with one exception there, you had to take an oath to become an Essene. But once you were an Essene, there was actually, you took an oath, and then there was like a waiting period there of some number of months before you would be fully accepted in them, in their community there. But then once you were an Essene, like I said, no oaths whatsoever. None. Okay. They did not practice animal sacrifice. Okay. Probably not because of particular religious beliefs, but if you're out living in the middle of the desert and you got a few livestock with not much food and water around, what are you probably going to use the livestock for? Sacrifice to God or feeding yourself there. So that was part of their beliefs there. They were very big on ritual washing, community living, and asceticism. I mean, they basically, they were socialists there. You had only what you needed. You did not have anything at all beyond what you needed to survive in terms of shelter, food, and clothing there. And whatever you did have above that was shared amongst the whole community as there was need there. Okay? And, of course, the main thing about the Essenes, the number one thing, if people know about the Essenes, they know they're the authors of the Dead Sea Scrolls. Okay? Almost certainly. I mean, you can't absolutely prove it, but it's about as certain as anything you can say there about non-biblical history from this time period. Okay, and if you remember, the Dead Sea Scrolls were discovered in 1947 by a little shepherd boy who was out tending his sheep. He was a little boy. There was a cave. He threw a rock into the cave, just being a boy, and heard something breaking. He went to investigate, and that turned out to be one of the pots that contained what we now know of as the Dead Sea Scrolls, which is probably one of the most significant archaeological finds in terms of all the things that it confirms there about, the validity of things like the book of Isaiah and whatnot there. Okay? All right. All right, so that is the Pharisees, the Sadducees, the Essenes. Yes, Brother Robert.
I'm very glad you mentioned the Dead Sea Scrolls, because that's kind of all we have to go by in our time about the actual evidence, pure evidence of the life of Christ, of the Bible, and everything else that we do. And if we don't understand that, if we don't hold on to that, we're just as bad as people before us. So
Yeah.
I'm glad you mentioned the Dead Sea Scrolls.
Yeah, they are continuing to be studied. There are, technology is neither good nor bad there. Okay, obviously I work very much in technology there. It just is. One of the things that's kind of amazing now is some of these scrolls that have been melded together, either by heat, by fire, and whatnot, and literally cannot be unrolled. We now have the technology where via specialized, basically think of super fMRI scanners there, we have the ability to read into those scrolls and see what they actually say there. So there is ongoing discovery being made from those Dead Sea Scrolls. So, did I get that halfway right, Marnie? Okay, good. All right, there. Marnie would know way more about that than I would there, so. All right. Yes, Brother Terry.
Yeah, the three groups that you just reviewed here, how did the Samaritans link up with any of this?
So the Samaritans do predate any of these three groups there, because the Samaritans were, I believe it was during the captivity and especially after the captivity, they were the ones who interbred with non-Jews. So they were half-breeds, and because of that, that is why the true Jews, double quotes around that, rejected them.
It's interesting to me that Christ has a lot of connectivity in the things that he talks about, it teaches about, using them as examples. He meets the woman at the well, talks about the Samaritan that stops and helps the person that's been rolled, those types of things. And he uses that, and having used that, that's why I just asked the question. These three groups, how much of what they were was blended into the Samaritan society in any way?
So, I didn't look into that specifically, but given that the Samaritans, again, predate any of these three groups, and have you thought about this? So basically, the Sadducees and the Essenes, okay, are from about 150 or so BC until 70 AD. They're only around for 220 years, okay? Less time than the United States of America has been in existence there. Pharisees are a little bit longer there because, there's no, I can't put up a bullet point here that says in AD blah, 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 there were no more Pharisees, okay, there. But they did exist well into the second, maybe even the beginning of the third century there, okay, but still only a few hundred years. Now, think about that. Let's say 300 years there, roughly, okay? The Samaritans were around for more than 300 years prior to the start of any of these three groups, okay? So their beliefs and practices would have been well established already, and I did not see anything in my study that mentioned Samaritan influence on any of these groups. The closest thing would be the Sadducees being heavily influenced by basically their conquerors, first the Hellenists, then the Romans, so forth. Yeah. Great question. Yes, Brother Calvin.
In terms of attitude, they all still exist.
Well, yeah, there is that. We definitely have people who are like all of those three groups still today. Because, aren't there people that are too good to associate with common people like us? Okay, aren't there people who think, oh, we just got to completely separate from society and live in our own little commune? Okay, Yeah, they definitely, Calvin. Yeah. All right. Any other questions or comments? Well, we have 1:18 left in class, so I am, my little brief thing that I was going to do here at the beginning of class, thank you for your questions and comments. That was great. I hope you found this little side thing useful this morning there. And thank you again for, Brother Robert, do you have?
Just appreciate you chasing that rabbit. It was a big rabbit, and you did, and that's a good thing.
Well, thank you. Yeah. I mean, I really, when I started reading here, I was like, oh man, we could do a month or so on this. So this was intended to be like a 15-minute segue into our class today. But I do appreciate your comments and your questions there. And again, thank you for your time. We'll pick back up with Acts chapter